Hello, my name is Bethany Bradley. I am a professor in environmental conservation at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and my background is largely in invasive plants and climate change. So today we have this in two parts. First part that we're going to talk about now are the implications of climate change for invasive plants in the Northeast. And then the second part after this is going to talk about climate smart invasive species management. Before I get started, I just want to acknowledge that all of the work, or the vast majority of the work that you're going to see today, has been funded by federal grants, especially for the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network, or RISC network, and through the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. All right, so we'll start with something that I imagine a lot of this audience already knows, that invasive plants cause harm to ecosystems. So this graph is from a meta-analysis, which is a statistical method of combining the results from lots of previous individual analyses. So in a single study in ecology, lots of things might explain why you'd see, for example, lower native plant growth in invaded areas. So maybe there was some past disturbance, or maybe the soils are different or something like that. But if you combine dozens or hundreds of individual studies in a meta-analysis framework, then we have a lot more confidence that all of these individual studies are collectively showing a consistent pattern of invasive plant impact. So the way to read these graphs is that if the error bars don't cross 0 for the effect size, so that's on the x-axis, then we can consider that to be a significant effect. And everything outlined in red on here, those are ones where there's a significant effect. So you can see that these show that there is a significant negative effect on plant growth, plant abundance, plant diversity, and plant fitness when you have invasive plants present, and that there's a significant negative effect on animal abundance and animal fitness when you have invasive plant presence, but also a suggestion of a negative effect for other animal things like behavior diversity, production, and growth. The numbers after each of those categories refer to the number of studies. So negative, 0, and positive effects of invasive plants are lined up there. And you can see that those also strongly skew towards negative impacts of invasive plants. So these graphs generally tell us that invasive plants lead to lower plant growth rates, lower plant abundance, diversity, and fitness, and also lower animal abundance and fitness. So good evidence, and this is actually from a 2011 meta-analysis that was a synthesis of literature through 2009. So we've got a lot more evidence today, but even as of 2009, this is a very clear pattern. Or another way we could look at this is to just see a picture of kudzu invasion. So kudzu is known as the vine that ate the South. You can see in this picture kudzu climbing up lots of trees, and this is a house in the foreground that it has climbed up and over. So we don't necessarily need meta-analyses to tell us that invasive plants are likely harming ecosystems. And so now, on top of all of this, we're saying, okay, now we need to think about climate change layering on top of what we're already observing on invasive plant impacts on ecosystems. So that's what we're talking about today. If you want to read about this, the best place to go is a paper that was published in 2024, so Climate Smart Invasive Species Management for 21st Century Global Change Challenges by Eva Kohlberg and others. And there's a QR code on here if that's the easiest way for you to find that. And you can also use a shorter synthesis cheat sheet. This is from a figure that was put together by the Northeast Risk Management Network. And I'm going to do a whirlwind through these 6 major ways that climate change interacts with invasive species. So the first 3 of them, 1, 2, and 3, are tied directly to warming temperatures. The 4th is tied to climatic extremes, and the 5th and 6th are both tied to rising CO2. And you can find this, you can Google the Northeast Risk Network and find our website, but there's a QR code on here that you can find this as well. All right, so starting with that first piece of the effects of warming on invasive species. So the 2021 IPCC report, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, reported that it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. That's pretty much the strongest possible language that scientists are willing to use or able to use to show that climate change is happening and that's caused by humans. In terms of how that warming affects, though, invasive species, this is a graph from another meta-analysis. So again, it's a statistical reanalysis of multiple different studies. And the blue circles are studies with native species. The red squares are studies with invasive species. So you can see the one that's circled in red, with elevated temperature, the invasive species have a significant positive effect size, but native species do not, right? So the red species are not overlapping that 0 bar in effect size. The little star indicates that that's a significant difference. So we can interpret this as a significant positive relationship between warming temperatures and invasive plant performance. So the question is, okay, we've observed this, but what is a possible mechanism or reason that might be causing this? So the positive relationship between temperature and invasive plant performance from that last graph could be due to longer growing seasons. So this graph is from a study of over 100 years of herbarium records collected around Massachusetts from the early 1900s through the early 2000s. And they looked at the dates when the collected herbarium specimens were flowering and then measured change in flowering dates over time. So when they compared native plants and their flowering over time to invasive plants flowering over time, they found that invasive plants had shifted their flowering dates by 11 days earlier relative to native plants over that 100-year period. So the hypothesis for why this happened is that invasive plants tend to be more responsive to temperature. So as temperature gets warmer, they can emerge earlier and grow earlier, whereas native plants tend to be more responsive to day length. So as temperatures get warmer, they're kind of stuck because they're not responding to temperature, they're responding to the length of the day. And if your invasive plants, or any plants really, but if your invasive plants are emerging earlier than your native plants, you can end up with what ecologists refer to as priority effects. So basically, by the time a native plant is emerging later in the spring, the invasive plants are already on average 11 days old, which means that they're much bigger and more competitive against that, tiny emerging native plant. The early green up and associated priority effects are pretty common with invasive understory shrubs. So some pictures on the right are just some examples of buckthorn and barberry greening up really early in the spring in association with warming temperatures, while the forest canopy and other native species are still dormant. A second link to rising temperatures is the opening of new introduction pathways through the Northwest Passage. So the introduction of insect pests from temperate East Asia is a concern because we have similar climate conditions. Both temperate ecosystems, but our forests are very different, right? It's been a really long, hundreds of millions of years at least, since Asia and North America were connected. So the forest assemblages and the species are really different. So in invasion ecology, a concern about accidentally importing insects is that they'll more readily become invasive because the native species are what we would call naive to them. So that is, they didn't co-evolve, and so they don't have defense mechanisms or the appropriate defense mechanisms against imported pests. So for example, in East Asia, the emerald ash borer, which I'm sure you've heard about here in the Northeast, in the Northeast, emerald ash borer is likely to extirpate 5 or 6 species of ash tree that we have here. But in East Asia, where the emerald ash borer is native, it's only a minor pest because Chinese ash trees co-evolved defenses to the emerald ash borer. But our ash trees did not, and so they're much more susceptible. Historically, with sea ice, Arctic sea ice in place, most shipping from East Asia, so this is all your like goods, your any stuff that you're ordering on Amazon or what have you that's coming from East Asia, most of that shipping has come across the Pacific. So an accidentally imported insect pest has to survive that trip across the Pacific, plus it has to survive a bunch of time in, for example, a really hot and dry port like the Port of LA. And then it has to survive a bunch of time on a truck coming across the country through a lot of like dry desert places, which are not particularly hospitable to temperate pests. And all that happens before it gets introduced into a northeastern forest. And so we're relatively protected because a lot of those insect pests are going to die before they make it here. With the opening of the Northwest Passage, the introductions can be much more direct. So you can take an introduction straight from temperate East Asia, and it's going directly into a port of New York or New Jersey, for example. Much higher risk of that direct import for our Northeast forests. And there are a lot of pests stowing away on our imports. So this is particularly problematic for wood boring beetles like the emerald ash borer, because most packaging materials are made from wood. So like the pallets shown in this image are wood based. And then the figure on the right is from a 2015 study of wood packaging materials that were imported into a sample of 6 different US ports. And they reared larvae and did DNA analysis in that study, and they were able to identify 275 different species of wood-boring beetles just in that wood packaging material. So there are already a lot of these critters getting imported, and climate change is helping them get to their optimal Northeast habitat. A third link to increased temperature is the likelihood that invasive plants will expand their ranges or become more invasive with climate change. Range expansions of invasive species always come up as a priority concern for management. And for us in the Northeast, we've kind of got a lot to worry about. So this study from 2016, led by Jenica Allen, was an analysis of almost 900 different invasive plants across the continental US. And the goal was to figure out where they might shift with climate change. And so this is all of those 900 species basically stacked on top of each other. And it's showing that in the next 25 years, so by 2050, we could be looking at up to 100 new invasive plants coming into the Northeast and New England regions. So these are all species that are in the US already, plants that are invasive right now in the mid-Atlantic or Southeast that are basically headed our way. So we see an increase in the diversity of invasive plants. Another aspect that's closely related to range shifting species is the concept of sleeper species. So a sleeper species is one that is introduced and established, but at the moment it's not expanding or having impact. So that is, it's not currently invasive at a given location. But with climate change, the species population could grow such that it becomes invasive because the climate conditions become suitable for it. So that's this, climate conditions are warm enough and suddenly you see this rapid population growth. So because plants tend to be introduced into lots of different places, sleeper species are pretty likely to be invasive already someplace else. So we can look to our south to see, or even globally to see if that species is already invasive. We're not expecting like whole populations of introduced species to suddenly become invasive when they've never shown any invasive tendencies anywhere in the past, only that kind of predictable subset of species that are already invasive in warmer regions. So the difference between a range shifting species and a sleeper species at a given location is simply whether a population of the species already exists there. So for a range shifting species, the population doesn't yet exist, and management would focus on prevention and limiting pathways of introduction, whereas for a sleeper species, the population already exists, and so management would focus on eradication. All right, so that was it for increasing temperatures. Now we can move on to the effects of extreme events on invasive species. Atlantic hurricanes are becoming more frequent and more intense with climate change. So these graphs show numbers on the top, like frequency of hurricanes on the top and intensity of hurricanes on the bottom. The blue values on there are all from before satellites were measuring these things, so they might be slightly less accurate. And the red values are measured by satellites, so pretty darn accurate. And what you can see, the trend lines fit to both of those graphs, is that they're both above zero, right? They're on the rise. So we are seeing increasing numbers and intensity of hurricanes across the North Atlantic. And we've been pretty lucky in New England that not as many hurricanes have hit southern New England, but that is probably just a matter of time. So how does that interact with invasive plants? So first, invasive plants thrive with increased disturbance, right? Disturbance basically creates a space with a whole bunch of underutilized resources, right? There's suddenly a bunch of light, there's a bunch of soil with nobody growing on it, there's extra water, and invasive plants, because they're really competitive, tend to be really good at colonizing disturbed areas because they're, the first ones to get in there, and they can grow bigger, faster, stronger than a lot of our native species. And also because there's a lot of seed bank there in many cases already. A second piece is that recovery from storms can also cause invasive species to spread because road crews and other restoration projects tend to move a lot of soil, and soil, depending on where it comes from and how it's treated, can often contain a lot of invasive species seeds or plant parts, and not just plants, but also, insects that we don't necessarily want to move around. Where am I at now? So fifth and sixth pieces are related to atmospheric CO2 on the rise. As of 2026, which is when I'm recording this, it is above 430 parts per million. So we're like off of, just at the top of, basically at the top of this graph right now. This is a really clear long-term trend of rising CO2 that's measured on the Big Island of Hawaii. So they chose that spot on Mauna Loa volcano to be basically like as far away as you can get from big cities and from human populations, with a goal of, plus it's really high up in the air. And so they're trying to measure an overall global pattern of CO2 that's not like directly affected by LA or something like that being right nearby. The red line that you see is the kind of day-to-day, week-to-week, whatever pattern. And that sawtooth pattern is actually caused by seasons. So most plant biomass is in the northern hemisphere, right? There's a lot more land in the northern hemisphere than there is in the southern hemisphere, like relative to ocean. So in the northern winter, CO2 is climbing rapidly, and then in the northern summer, it's dropping rapidly because the plants are sucking it all in, right? But the most important line on here is the black, which is the long-term average. That's the main thing to pay attention to, that the rise in CO2 caused by human emissions is not slowing down. Arguably, it's still increasing. Increasing. The rate of increase is also increasing. One piece with this, though, is that CO2, right? Remember that if you remember from basic biology class, plants need CO2 to photosynthesize. So plants do better with higher CO2. This is actually an image from a website sponsored by ExxonMobil and the Heartland Institute describing why CO2 emissions are green, and so you shouldn't worry about them. The challenge here, though, is that, it kind of depends on the plant, like who's going to grow better or worse matters. So these stats of trees are growing 50% more, crops, shrubs, flowers, whatever, those are from only a few hundred species that we have any information for. So most of those are either like a handful of native species to the US, or they're staple crop species like corn, wheat, soybeans, pine trees. So you don't really end up with a whole lot of comparisons for most ecosystems, we like have no idea relatively how species are going to perform. But if we consider invasive species as a group, they tend to be one of the big winners with elevated CO2. So this is back to that meta-analysis that I showed you earlier for elevated temperature. And so now I'm adding the other bar, which is for elevated CO2. And what you can see is that if you look at the blue circle, right, native species are performing better with their effect sizes or barely crosses the zero there. So they're performing better with rising CO2. But invasive species, the red square up there, are performing even better than native plants. And that's probably because invasive plants are resource hogs and CO2 is a resource that enables faster growth. So that creates an even stronger competitive advantage for invasive plants. And so kudzu is probably, right, we looked at this before, the poster child for rapid growth that requires a lot of resources, right? If you give kudzu a lot of resources, it can grow whatever it is, like 2 feet a day or something like that. And so the extra CO2 in the air is probably helping that. And then the last thing to be aware of is that rising CO2 has also been shown to reduce herbicide efficacy. So these are some experiments. These are getting a little old at this point. So from a paper in 2004, experiments with Canada thistle, which is more of an agricultural weed. The plot on the left was exposed to ambient atmosphere, which was about 400 parts per million CO2, so like a little bit lower than today. And then the plot on the right was exposed to about 750 parts per million of CO2. The projections that are most aligned with current emissions trajectories put us closer to like 550 to 650 parts per million of CO2 by the end of the century. So the image on the right is hopefully like a worst case scenario, but it's still illustrative of what's going on. So anyway, plants in both of these plots were sprayed with the same recommended amounts of glyphosate a single time, and then they were left alone. So you can see that the ones with elevated CO2, the future CO2, the ones on the right, those plants were much more likely to recover from that herbicide treatment. And this is because with increasing CO2, plants seem to put a lot more of their biomass below ground in their roots. And so the recommended amounts and numbers of times that you might need to apply herbicides may be becoming less and less effective because invasive plants are more likely to recover from that below ground root biomass. All right, so that's the whirlwind through these 6 ways that invasive species, invasive plants interact with climate change. Feel free to check out the cheat sheet on the Northeast Risk Management Network website. And we also have another cheat sheet of taking actions. So managing invasive species in the context of climate change, which you can find at this QR code or on the Risk Network website. So stay tuned for part 2 of this presentation where we'll talk more about what we can do about it.